I'm going to be doing statistics on the struggles with ADHD. I found this really interesting subject, just to talk about, just because it's an increasing thing. There is more people with ADHD that we're discovering, more every day. It's becoming a more common thing than it was before. And I wanted to focus more on the idea that how, from your adolescence to your college ages, does it affect your adulthood, basically, if you have ADHD. So what we're going to be observing here is, the age groups. So obviously anything from adolescence to adulthood. So we kind of want to get an idea of, what happened in those stages that kind of led them to what happens in their future, I guess. So we want to kind of factor in things like schooling, careers, college life, stuff like that. What we want to exclude is things like race, gender, household, life at house, like life in your household, any matters that has to do with that, location, where you live. So we want to kind of exclude all that. I know that's a lot to skip over. However, there's a bigger issue when it comes to schooling, because schooling is, for a lot of students, most of their day. So most of their day is spent at school. So it does play a very major big factor in how the students develop later in their, later years. So I wanted to focus on that a little bit more, and what goes on in their school life and really what it affects in their life. So what is ADHD? So basic overview. Basically, it's a disorder that you're born with. The effects are that you have a shorter attention span, you're hyperactive, which also causes you to be kind of bad with like time management, or just tasks overall. Having to remember all those things does cause, not like you're not doing it on purpose, but you tend to forget a lot of things that could be important or not important. ADHD and statistics. Well, ADHD and statistics. American population has about the 6% of them are ADHD, and then for children, it's 11.4% that have ADHD, which I guess is pretty small. But when you think about it, this also is not kind of factoring in that there is a lot of people that go with undiagnosed ADHD. So they could have ADHD, but they're not, reporting that part, because sometimes either they just don't know they have it, or sometimes they don't want to report it. Sometimes they just feel embarrassed. But I guess every year we're also experiencing an increase. So these can change pretty quickly over time. Experiments. So this is one of the biggest things. Experiments. So I researched. It wasn't really for this one specifically. Wasn't really an experiment, but more of like a data analysis, which I thought was also useful. According to recent studies done outside of America, they have shown that in the Swedish school system, that when they were observing over the couple of years that they were, observing these students, they noticed lower GPAs as well as negative outcomes from their, tests. So whenever there's a test taken, there's usually a negative outcome. So it's like usually a bad score. And their schooling system is a little bit different. So it's really hard to explain. However, they, in short terms, they basically have a couple years to complete these certain subjects, from what I'm understanding, and then based off of only a certain amount of those subjects, they have to get a certain score, and then they graduate. So one of the results of that, or specifically in that area, is that 12.5% of the students with ADHD graduated later than their expected date, whereas compared to the non-ADHD students, they graduated 3.8% of them graduated later than their expected date. So it's a smaller, there's a big difference in that area, that only a smaller amount of them graduated later. Whereas, ADHD, we do see a bigger amount of them, not graduating as soon as possible. Another experiment. This was a really interesting one. It was done by Walden University with a couple of college students. They basically had the idea of comparing ADHD students to non-ADHD students when taking a test specifically. So, unfortunately, the population or the sample was very small. It's only 6 students. So, you really can't, there's really not a lot to, unravel here when it comes to like that few students. So unfortunately, you're not going to have the most accurate results, but you'll still see what's going on here. But how they ran their experiment, it was really interesting. They had a math test and an English test, since those are the two main subjects that you'll need to learn in your school years. So basically, since they're elementary students, they're going to give them simple adding and subtracting equations or problems. So they gave them that for their math test, and then for the English test, I thought it was really interesting that they had them copy 10 sentences on the board. So basically, they wrote 10 sentences on the board. The students, all they had to do was just copy what was on the board. When it came to results, in both tests, they actually scored a lot lower than students without ADHD, which I thought was also interesting because it kind of goes to show that students with ADHD do struggle when it comes to test taking, which we've seen in this experiment, as well as the analysis done in the last slide. So we can kind of see it. There's a correlation between these kind of things right here. So I thought that was really interesting. The next thing, it was an experiment that was done by psychologists and human development experts. They didn't, unfortunately, really explain what their experiment was. However, the results that they got from it were interesting, and it was done for college students. So basically, the college students, they would get, they would analyze all of the data from them, and they noticed that students in college that have ADHD actually have lower GPAs as well, and they noticed it was by like a 0.5 to 0.75 difference, which I thought was also really interesting because it kind of still goes to show that there's a correlation between lower grades and ADHD. So I think that's really interesting. Future effects. So kind of talking about how it affects you in the future. Really, what happens when you're older. We get to see things like this right here. So according to the Attention Deficit Disorder Association, the ADDA, there seems to be a noticeable difference between people with ADHD and people without ADHD. One of the big things was income. So you'll see right here, the income is a little bit less than the average. What's also interesting is that 30% are more likely to have employment issues. So basically, they're struggling to find jobs. 60% are more likely to be fired from their job, which is also really interesting. And 3 times more likely to quit from their job due to stress. This was a really interesting finding here because, we get to kind of see, what really happens when you go to the career world. So I thought that was really interesting. And the overall analysis is that we kind of see a correlation between bad grades, low GPAs, ADHD. All of it has to do with ADHD and struggles with career. I think another thing that was interesting was that I seen that when you're younger, all these habits that you develop as a person with ADHD, 60% of the children, when they grow up, when they become adults, 60% of them, they tend to actually still hold on to those habits that they had as kids when having ADHD habits. So, like, time management, all that stuff that I mentioned earlier. They tend to have those issues still, which could be, one of the reasons why, the last slide brought up all the facts about employment and career issues. So I think that was really interesting. 40%, I'm assuming, don't have issues or habits that they used to have when they were little, which I also think is interesting too, because there's an assumption that could be made here that the 40% that don't show habits that they had when they were little must mean that they had some way of getting out of it, which I think was interesting. So I think one thing here is we should kind of analyze what really gets a student out of that. One thing I think is also interesting is how do the school systems really deal with this? One thing I also analyze is that school systems, one of the most common things that we know about school systems of what they do to help students with mental disorder or any disorder in general is that they put them on plans. So, like, if you've heard of a 504 in school, 504 kind of gives students an extension by the teachers for their assignments and all that stuff. So 504s are useful for students with ADHD. However, it doesn't help them with, from what I've seen in the research, it doesn't help them with getting out of their habits. So that could be why we're seeing this issue with employment, or these issues with careers. These school systems find a way to develop a plan to help students get past school. However, there's been no study or showings of what people can do to help them get out of it when they get to their careers. So I think it really is interesting with all that stuff. And unfortunately, there could have been more done to help all these people with ADHD. And flaws in the study. So some flaws, obviously, I'm sure you could see there's not a whole lot of background more to what the population sizes are. One of the experiments didn't really give a result on what they did for their tests. However, they gave the results of what came out of those tests. So I think that was a big struggle when it came to that. It's still a developing concept of ADHD and correlations with schooling. I'm sure there could be a lot more done. I just thought it was a really interesting subject to talk about, how the likeliness of things when it comes to ADHD. But yeah, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.